David, welcome to the show.
Aiden, it's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you on. It's not often that we get folks from the military or from the Marine Corps on the show. So this is a treat for me. I think that um, a lot of lessons of leadership actually tend to be tend to be learned from the armed forces, and so I think there's a lot that we're going to go into today. You have been commanding officer at the Marine Corps, trained over 200 elite aviators as a Top Gun instructor. And you've spent 3 decades leading high performing teams. And now you have this new book called The Substance of Leadership. And you're also the founder and CEO of Vertical Performance Enterprises. So there's a lot that we're going to get into, but I wanted to kick things off by asking you, in your career, who has been the most memorable leader that you've reported to and why?
Yeah. Aiden, I really honestly can't narrow that down to one individual person. And the reason for that is because in the US Marine Corps, I was just really blessed and privileged to have so many leaders who set the example and really taught me how to lead. And so I'm just so grateful for their collective leadership. In fact, so grateful that the book that you just mentioned, that The Substance of Leadership, I've dedicated the book to all of those Marines who set the example, that taught me how to lead. And I'm so grateful. And many of them, I stood on their shoulders, and it's just was a wonderful experience.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And so let's talk about then when you first started to lead teams. I know that through the course of your career, you were in charge of as many as 2,500 people, $12 billion of assets, $35 million annual budget. So you've done a lot of you basically led very large groups, but let's go back to the beginning. So what were some of the early mistakes that you tended to make?
Well, you mentioned 2,500 people. I was, as a commanding officer toward the end of my career. It started with two, and in the Marine Corps, you lead on day one. It's just the way it works, and so you want to make sure you do it right. I'll tell you, made a lot of early mistakes. The one that comes to mind that I try to share with other junior leaders that I think is really important is, as a junior leader, I tended to talk first and listen last. And when I talk to junior leaders about things that they can do to become better leaders, I think it's natural for us when we're junior and we're just starting out in a leadership role to feel like we have to really show our credibility by knowing what we're talking about. And that's natural. But what I found over time, from going from two to then 10 and 100 and 500 and then eventually 2,500 people, that if I would listen first and speak last, a few things would happen. Number one, people tended to share their honest opinions without feeling like, since I spoke first, oh, well, then, obviously that's the answer. That's what we need to do because the boss said, that's what we need to do. And the other thing that it does is not only promotes innovation in that regard, but it really starts to instill a sense of ownership in others when you ask questions about how they would solve problems and how they see challenges. And I'll tell you, when I got up to leading so many people, most of the time when I would ask questions first and speak last and weigh in with my opinion or experience, individuals on my team came up with ideas that I never would have thought on my own. So I always encourage junior leaders not to make the same mistake I did. Ask questions. It doesn't show that you are necessarily ignorant about anything. It actually shows that you're interested in the skills and experience of your people, and that you're willing to listen and factor that into your decision making.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Is there like an example scenario or an illustration that we could think about where like someone might want to jump in, but it's much better to ask questions? And I guess like these questions, like what are the nature of them? Are you trying to get their opinion on how they would handle a situation, or is it more to just dive deeper to figure out what the root of the problem is?
Yeah, I mean, one example would be, if you're in a typical, maybe a staff meeting, if you're a VP, an SVP, or even a CEO, and you've got a complex problem and you need people to weigh in on how we should solve this problem as a team and what are some things to think about. Too many times, the leader will lead with their opinion. And what's common then is for others just to kind of get on board with that because they feel like that's it's already been decided. And it's natural for us to try to follow consensus sometimes, and it's sometimes harder to go against the boss, when the boss has an opinion. So I've always encouraged in that situation when we're brainstorming. I found it very effective as a leader, and I did this with my senior direct reports, just by opening up the aperture and saying, okay, here's the problem statement. Would love to hear your all's thoughts on how we could go about solving the problem. What do you think the risks are? What are the opportunities that we may not have thought about? Go around the table, and then I would weigh in with my thoughts and perspectives, normally in the form of a question, like, have we thought about this? Has anyone ever seen this before? So it's less about asserting your opinion and more about trying to facilitate that and draw it out of your team. And then, of course, at some point, Aiden, we all have to make a decision. And then it's, I think, incumbent upon the leader to make that decision in a timely fashion, and then explain the why behind that decision was made, and thank the individuals around that table for weighing in with their opinions so that next time they'll be encouraged to do the same.
Yeah, I think that sums together nicely all of the different ways. One is obviously let everybody else speak first, and then when you are giving your opinions, forming those as questions rather than assertions. I think that's obviously clever, and I like the way that you summarize the decisions and thank everybody. I think like that is it's almost like a nice playbook of how to do it. So I think everybody will appreciate that. One thing that I wanted to chat with you about is this concept of a leadership triad. You have spent a lot of time with high performing teams, and and you talk about this in your book as well. So why don't we start with talking about what is a leadership triad?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Maybe I'll provide a little context on how I landed on the leadership triad. 10 years ago, when I was transitioning from the military to the private sector, a friend of mine in a Fortune 100 company asked if I could come out to the West Coast in the US and speak to a large group of executives on how to lead a high performing team in a high pressure environment. And my time slot was an hour. So, he requested 45 minutes of talking and then, 15 minutes of Q&A. Aiden, it was one of the hardest things I'd ever done because I kind of felt like I knew how to lead a high performing team, but to try to synthesize that into 45 minutes into some type of a mental framework that people could get their head around, understand it from a number of broad industries was quite a challenge. But it was one of the most rewarding things that I ever did because it really forced me to really get crystal clear on what I think matters most about leading a high performing team. In other words, we all have limited time and energy. Where do you focus your effort? And where I landed after thinking back over 3 decades of leadership from a follower's perspective and then a leader's perspective was 3 focus areas: culture, people, and mission. And so that's the leadership triad. And I unpack this in the book. It's really a simple framework that I've come up with that I think distills in some ways the complexity of leadership into those 3 essential focus areas.
And I'd love to dig in a bit more. I mean, in particular, for example, mission might be a little bit more self-explanatory, but but you also have culture and people as separate items there. How would you define them to be separate?
Yeah, well, I think culture is some people say of your triad, is there any area that's more important than the others? In the book, I have a whole chapter on how important it is to balance these 3 and to keep them in balance. There are some tensions between those, but I think a high performing team really starts, the foundation is your culture, and I think in many ways that's the set of shared values and attitudes that your team has that really characterizes the essence of your team. I see it as the lens from through which your people see your mission. Those other 2 areas of the triad. For me, the center of gravity of a high performing culture is trust. And so the next question from people is normally, well, how do you develop a culture of trust? And my experience, it comes down to what I call the 3 C's. The first is leading with character. And on a day-to-day basis for leaders, I think we can simplify that. That just means that we are committed to doing the right thing. The second C is competence. That means we know our stuff. And on a day-to-day basis, we're committed to doing things right. And then the third C for me is all about composure. And that's where our real character shines under adversity. And it's maintaining, setting the right tone and maintaining a positive tone in the midst of challenges. So, when you lead with those three C's, I have found that that really generates a culture of trust on your team where I found that people will do anything for each other to keep from letting their teammates down.
Can we talk about an example of maybe what a story of when you demonstrated one of these and you thought it was a very self-reinforcing, I guess, trust factor for your team?
I'll talk about the third C, composure. That's something that I think a lot of leaders struggle with. I feel like we've probably all worked for or known a leader that shot the messenger when bad news came to them. Right? It only takes two or three times before people stop bringing any news whatsoever because they just don't have that emotional composure, and many times they overreact to adversity. I think under pressure, that lack of composure and sometimes even panic under pressure can spread like wildfire throughout an organization. I'll give you a personal example where I really learned this in many ways the hard way. In 2006, I was serving in Iraq as the director of air operations in the western sector of Iraq, an area about twice the size of my home state of South Carolina. Was responsible for air support and medical evacuations for about 30,000 Marines and soldiers on the ground and about 200 aircraft. And one afternoon, we noticed on the video feed in the command center that there, from the drone overhead, the base we were operating out of, there was a large mob forming at the front gate. And then in the distance, a couple miles away, two white sedans speeding toward that front gate at a very high rate of speed on dusty roads. Almost immediately, we started taking mortar fire on the north end of the sector there in our base where the helicopters were parked. And then, as if things couldn't have gotten worse, 6 simultaneous firefights erupted, and we started to experience a number of mass casualties. And I'll be honest, I started as the person responsible for responding to all of these contingencies at the same time with air support. I started to sense the urge to panic. I'll be honest with you, just physically and emotionally. And then I had a flashback to about 3 years earlier. I was sitting in a classroom listening to a combat leadership lecture by a retired lieutenant general in the Army. His name was Hal Moore, and he wrote a book called We Were Soldiers Once and Young. It was made into a movie in which Mel Gibson played Hal Moore. And
Oh, cool. Which movie was that?
it's called We Were Soldiers
Oh,
Once. It
oh,
just has
cool.
the same name
That's
as the
awesome.
book. Yeah, so your audience should check out the book or the movie. It's a really fantastic story. The one thing I remember that day, he said, if you remember nothing else, if you find yourself in a combat leadership situation, it's inevitable when the pressure's on and lives are on the line, you will physically and emotionally feel the urge to panic. And when that happens, take a deep breath, speak calmly and clearly, because if you don't, it will only get worse. And so I took that advice on board and I, huddled up my air directors and I told them two things, Aiden. I said, look, things are bad right now. We don't have enough resources to respond to all the incoming requests for medical evacuations. What I need you to do is think outside the box, be innovative, keep me informed on what you're doing, so I can have your back, and so you can trust me to back you up. And then second of all, I need you to take a deep breath before you start directing air traffic on the radio so that they don't sense that we're panicking because it'll spread like wildfire. Some very, very innovative things happened. And we didn't save everyone that afternoon, but we did make the most of a bad situation. I felt like my team was able to trust me emotionally and they trusted that I had their back. I trusted them and empowered them to come up with some very creative solutions that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. And it all went back to Hal Moore's recommendation and advice about under pressure. Composure is really important because it instills emotional trust in your team. And when your team begins to develop that emotional trust, then that really enhances other forms of trust as well.
Yeah, that's such an excellent example. I mean, kudos to you for being able to do that in such a high pressure situation. It is quite challenging to do that even in situations where no one's life is on the line. So that is definitely a skill that is very useful to develop. One question that I had, which is along the lines of culture, you kind of talked about your team's culture as well. The Marines have cultural values that are for all Marines, and there are things that define what a Marine is. Is there also subcultures that exist within different teams that you've led, and how does that work?
Yeah, well, going back to your point, I mean, the Marine Corps' values, U.S. Marine Corps values, are honor, courage, and commitment, and those are the three overarching values that define the ethos or the culture of every Marine Corps organization. But I think there are subcultures, and I actually encourage leaders who are leading teams within a larger organization to determine what they believe are their most important values for their individual team, because teams within a larger organization, Aiden, as you well know, sometimes have a different slice of the mission than another team within that organization. And I always encourage them to personalize their culture, but to make sure that that culture is aligned with the overarching culture of the larger organization, and it's in support of those larger organizational values. But I think it's really important for leaders to be authentic with their own values and how they want to create the own culture on their team, as long as it's not in any way in opposition or contrary to the overarching culture of the larger organization.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a really good point, which is that different teams can have slightly different missions, because each team will have, or each organization will have, a different objective, and so it's not crazy to see that they will have different subcultures, like you mentioned, because they're going to have different ways of doing things, different norms, and so a lot of that starts to make sense, and it is important for a leader to be able to identify that, and as long as, again, you're not violating sort of like the overarching values, then I think that's a worthwhile action for
Yeah.
managers to take. One thing that is an interesting question. We talk about high performing teams, and a lot of your writing and a lot of the work you do has been around this topic. But one question that I have is, how do you know if you have a high performing team? So, for example, if a manager is trying to evaluate and say, well, high performing teams sound great, how do I know if I have one, and if I don't, then I'll work on creating one?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I have to put in a little plug on my website, verticalperformance.us. I actually developed a 5-minute survey. It's 15 questions where leaders can actually invest 5 minutes, and it'll provide some feedback on, are you, leading a team that can perform consistently at a high level? And Aiden, it's tied to those three elements, dimensions of the leadership triad that I just mentioned. It all comes down to, do you have a culture of trust? And there are some ways to determine, whether or not, your people trust you, and whether or not they trust each other. Do your people feel like they're respected, that they are valued as an important member of the team, or do they feel disrespected and disenfranchised and in some ways micromanaged? That would be a key indicator of a high performing team. And then on the mission side, I think it comes down to, does your team feel empowered, and do they feel like that they are part of something larger than themselves? And can they articulate and grasp the overarching vision, and do they understand how their individual role contributes to that overarching vision? When you put these three elements together in harmony, then that's the clearest way that I've found to determine whether or not your team is high performing. Many times we get wrapped around metrics. That's fine, as long as the metrics are an accurate representation of what we're really trying to achieve. And that's great. And we do need to measure that. But in many ways, it comes down to, is your team really reaching its full potential in terms of how good it can actually be in the mission that you need to accomplish?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now I want to go take that quiz. I didn't know about it on your website. I will definitely check it out. One thing that is maybe is an interesting question to ask is, one of the mistakes that, like, we often talk about, or previous guests have talked about, is leaders not doing the appropriate storytelling, or just talking about the mission. And you just mentioned mission, and how it's really important for a team to say, like they understand the mission and it's almost greater than themselves.
Yeah.
For some of the things that happen, I would imagine maybe that's obvious, but I wanted to ask, how often do you, as leaders, say in the Marine Corps, do you like repeat what the mission is, or do storytelling around that and why it's important? Is that like a is that still an activity that you do very often?
Absolutely, Aiden. In the book I talk about, the question is, how do you connect your people to your mission? And I go into a discussion about really revolves around inspiring and empowering your team. And step one of inspiring your team is really to help them to get bought into the leader. But step two is to help them get bought into the mission. So how do you get them to buy into the mission so that they're emotionally invested in mission success? To me, it comes down to Patty Sanchez and Nancy Duarte wrote a book called Illuminate, and I really learned a lot from their book about 4 techniques for illuminating your mission or your vision, so that people can really get emotionally invested in it. And it revolves around speeches where it's not a long speech, but it's an anecdotal way to really take some time to articulate the mission and really focus on why it's important. If you can just get to the why, people can really start to embrace the purpose behind it. Storytelling is so important for making that emotional connection with people. As a squadron commander, I used to love to tell stories about the students that we trained that were out on the pointy end of the spear, so to speak, in combat, flying off of aircraft carriers, to tell my unit, how successful they had been at training them, because they were successful, and that was very effective. Also, the third element is this idea around ceremonies where we get to celebrate people and recognize them in front of their peers, which is so powerful. And then this idea of articulating or illuminating the mission is so important. I found, Aiden, that my people were really starting to understand the mission when I started to feel like I was sounding like a broken record. And it just took that much repetition, because there's turnover. And then I would ask people what the mission is, and when they could play it back, and I felt like they really understood it and felt that conviction, then I knew that the message was getting through. But it takes time to get there.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you had to feel like you were like a broken record player, like you said, in for you to know that it was you were there. Because I guess the reason I think this is an important question is that you can't take for granted that, just because someone is a Marine, that they were almost like pre-selected. Not everybody becomes a Marine, and so like just because they have taken that oath, it doesn't mean that they necessarily there's many different missions at various times, and just like repeating that makes a lot of sense. But you also ask them, like, how does it work when you ask them, what do you think the mission is, or like what form does that take?
Yeah, I've always believed, and I've learned the hard way, that a message communicated is not always a message received, right? So I would just be completely vulnerable and humble, Aiden, and I would say at the end of a session or a talk, or if I was trying to explain the mission, I would simply say, I'm not always the best communicator. I would love for you to try to play back for me what you think I said, and then if they played it back, great. If they didn't, then I had a chance to refine that a little bit and say, well, I probably didn't explain that very well. Here's what I really meant by that. So I put it on me. The onus was on me as the leader to make sure that my team understood what I was trying to communicate.
Yeah, I think that's super valuable. I've definitely done the can you tell me what you heard? I just want to make sure we're on the same page. But the way that you put it is so much more eloquent. I'm not the best communicator always. And I love framing it in that way. I think that's such a super valuable tactical tool there. One thing, and we have a quote from you where you say, a leader's guidance is simply defining what your team needs to accomplish and why, and leaving the how up to them. So I think the highlighting of the mission, like you said, that's a lot of the what and the why, but I guess it comes down to leaving the how to them. If you're leaving the how to them, how do you also make sure that you're able to impart on them just lessons and things that you've learned, so that maybe they can take advantage of a lot of those things.
Yeah, this is a really fine line. I mean, one of the things when I work with leaders and do leadership development in the corporate world, one of the hardest things to really get across, and that is when we try to explain how to our people, it's very disempowering, and it can come across as micromanaging. And research continues to show that micromanagement is one of the main top 3 reasons consistently over the last decade why people leave teams. And if they don't leave, it's one of the main reasons why there's low morale on that team. So micromanagement is a real risk, because it's hard for people to get emotionally invested in something where they don't really feel like they have some control and some ability to shape the outcome. And so for me, when I try to define the what, I will then ask the person that I'm delegating to, for example, and this is what I recommend to leaders, is to ask them to come back in an acceptable amount of time with their recommendation on how to accomplish that. And I recommend that you offer them the opportunity to leverage your experience and expertise. And the way that I frame that, if I said, Aiden, thank you for being willing to take this on. This is really important for our organization. Would love for you to come back, in a couple of days. Let's talk about how you think we should solve this problem. I don't want to, tell you how I would do it, because I want to hear your thoughts. But if you are interested in learning some lessons that I may have learned the hard way in this area, or you want to leverage my expertise, I'd be happy to share that. I've never had anyone turn me down. But at the same time, I frame that as, okay, you may want to think about this. You might want to think about this. I made this mistake 4 or 5 times, would never do that again. It's always in the form of lessons that I've learned. And I might phrase recommendations as questions or things to think about or things to consider.
Yeah, I think that's such great tactical advice. I think that is super useful. And I love that you have definitely tried saying that if you'd like to hear some of the things that I've learned, I'm here to help. And it's also wonderful to know that nobody's ever turned you down on that. So I think that we can count as a good way to go about it. One thing I wanted to also talk to you about is you have this framework that you call the 3 Ps of the mission. So prioritization, preparation, and passion. Um, what are each of those? If you could just maybe like in a sentence or two describe those, because I think it'll help for people that want to go about illuminating a mission. Like you said, I think it might help them kind of get their minds wrapped around that.
Yeah. Well, when people say, hey, what does it take to really generate mission focus and to get your team laser focused on the mission? These are the 3 areas that I think are most important, Aiden. Prioritization. Look, I mean, we live in a world where the velocity and volume of information flow is just, increasing exponentially every year. And pretty soon it's information saturation, and it feels like everything is a priority. But as the saying goes, when everything's a priority, nothing is a priority. I think as leaders, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we are setting realistic priorities, not 50, because nobody can manage 50 priorities, but maybe 1 to 5 priorities, so that your team can really keep the main thing, if you will. So I think that's the foundation for mission success, so that we are properly focusing our resources, our time, and our energy on what matters most. That second P is around preparation. And quick story: when I was in college, I had I don't know how many sports fans you have in your audience, but I was a big basketball fan growing up. One of my all-time heroes was John Wooden, who was the coach of the century, according to ESPN. In the 20th century, led the UCLA Bruins to 10 NCAA basketball championships in 12 years in the 1960s and 70s. Unprecedented. I'm not sure that record will ever even be close to touched. I went to one of his basketball clinics just to observe, and afterwards introduced myself, and he invited me into his office. Couldn't believe it, for an hour. He was in the U.S. Navy and wanted to talk about some of his experiences. And being the impressionable junior leader that I was, I asked him. I said, Coach Wooden, you have been so successful as a leader. your team's players have had such great character. What is your secret? If there's anything, what would you point to? Without hesitation, he said preparation. That's what it's all about, preparation. And I took that on board, Aiden, and applied that to everything that I did in my military career and now in my corporate career. The question I think that we need to really ask ourselves as leaders is, what are we doing today to prepare our team for tomorrow's opportunity? And that's what I think really forms success as far as our mission is concerned. It's founded on prioritization, but I think our mission success is formed through constant preparation. And then the final P is passion, specifically passion for excellence, which I think fuels mission success. And when I say passion for excellence, what I really mean there is being dedicated to continuous improvement. And it starts with the leader. To the extent that you're willing to admit that you don't know everything, that you have a growth area, and that you are striving to get better tomorrow than you are today, that tends to cascade down throughout your entire team.
That's super interesting, and I now want to dig in. So my questions are like talking about preparation. I get it. Prioritization. I agree with you. You need to 1 to 5. They need to be clearly defined. Otherwise, people are going in all sorts of directions. So let's talk about preparation. Like, what does that tactically mean? For say that you have a, just any sort of company that you're working at. Say that you have a revenue goal. How does preparation work in that case?
Yeah. Well, let's take the example. I'm just thinking out loud with you here, and we can problem solve together. I mean, if you have a revenue goal, I think it'd be important, first of all, to look at what are the various components that would enable you to meet that revenue goal, right? I mean, so there's a sales and marketing component to that. There's going to be an operational component to that. There's probably a strategic communications component to that. You name it. You can fill in the blanks. But let's say that you break that down into what I'd call, maybe 3 to 5, high value areas of concentration. And then the next question is, for those individuals who are responsible for carrying out those lines of effort that are leading toward that goal or that mission, that priority of a revenue goal, what are the skills and areas of expertise that they need to have in order to be successful? And so are there training opportunities? Are there mentoring opportunities? Are there apprenticeship opportunities? Are there research opportunities? Are there other opportunities today to make sure that we are putting ourselves in a position to capitalize on opportunities that we may or may not be aware of? There might be when I say research, kind of a market intelligence component to that as well. And so I think it's all about reverse engineering. Where are we trying to go? Figuring out what are the avenues that we need to be really good at in order to get there. And then how do we get good, so to speak, at those areas that we need to get good at and start preparing now for tomorrow's opportunity. Tying that back to Coach Wooden, one of the things that he mentioned was that he didn't enjoy the games as much as the practices. His passion was all about preparing his team to perform when the game started. And his ultimate goal was to not have to coach at all during a game.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and that's amazing that you actually got to ask him that question and met him in person. That's amazing. What about passion, though? So, passion is an interesting one, and I like the way that you defined it because you said, well, you've got to. It comes from the leader, and there has to be like this desire to continuously get better at something. Would you say that like the question is, how do you get people on your team and everybody on your team to be passionate about what you're pursuing? I guess like part of this is, is everyone, I think everyone can be passionate about something. The trick is like, how do you get them to be passionate about the mission? Is there anything that you've learned or any interesting strategies that you've used to turn people that may have started as being not passionate into passionate about the mission or whatever is being tackled?
Yeah, I I'm passionate about talking about passion. That's I love talking about it. I think two things in my experience, Aiden, I'd love to share with you and get your thoughts. The first is around the standards that you set. And when I talk about setting standards of excellence, I like to think about, first of all, define the standard so that people can really understand, what the standards are and what we're trying to achieve. The second thing is to explain why that standard is important. I can't emphasize this enough. I found that if people understand the why, the purpose behind a standard, and how it's going to help the team achieve excellence, then they very quickly start to embrace a passion for that standard of excellence. But the third piece is probably the hardest, and that is the leader needs to hold themselves to an equal or higher standard. So when you clearly define the standard, explain the why it's important behind it, and then as a leader, hold yourself, set the example by holding yourself to an equal or higher standard, that's step number one. Step number two is all about being committed to self-improvement. And I find that this starts with a leader. At Top Gun, we had debriefs after every flight. I've flown 3,000 flights in my career, and after every flight, we debrief for at least an hour. At Top Gun, our debriefs were 6 hours long. Now,
Wow.
I'm not recommending that any of your listeners spend 6 hours debriefing everything that they do, but I am recommending after, every time you invest significant time or effort into something, huddle your team up and ask 3 simple questions. What happened relative to what we were trying to achieve? Number 2, why did it happen? Let's do some root cause analysis. Did we achieve our goal or not? And if not, why? And then third, how can we, not Dave Robinson, not Aiden, not Sue, not John, take the who out of it. How can we as a team collectively improve the next time that we do the same thing? And if the leader starts that debrief by admitting or explaining what they could have done better as the leader of the team, I've found that it really opens up the faucet, so to speak, for other people to pipe in and say, oh, you know what, I could have done this better. And now it's all about learning and team improvement. So you start with setting the standard, and then you talk about a passion for improvement. You put those together. I found that that's the formula for generating that passion for excellence in your team.
That is super, super helpful. I think there's a couple of points there that I wanna break down. So one was around the setting of the standard. You kind of implied that standards are contagious, and I do agree. My question is, how do you define a standard of excellence? Like, how do you go about defining what the standard is? I would imagine that some of this happens maybe in debrief sessions where you have an opportunity for feedback on whatever, like the flight or whatever else just occurred. What is the modality that you use to define the standard?
Yeah, I use what I recommend leaders have, what I call a leader's intent. And this is a way to, in many ways connect your culture to your mission. And I encourage leaders to think about 5 things. First of all, what is your mission? Can you articulate that? What is your vision? What does success look like? What are your values? That's the heart of your culture. What are your goals and priorities? We just talked about that. And then this 5th bucket, Aiden, is what I think you're talking about. That is, what are our expectations? What are our behavioral expectations? What can you expect from me as a leader? What do I expect from my team members as members of the team in terms of expectations? Many times those are performance expectations. Sometimes you can put very quantifiable metrics around those. Other times they're a little bit more subjective. And I know that you love one-on-one feedback and the way managers can develop those opportunities to help your team grow. This is an opportunity to enforce those standards. But they need to be measurable. They need to be clear. They need to be understood. And then once you set those standards, then we try to achieve them. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and tell you that I'm an advocate that as leaders, we ought to be setting standards of perfection. For example, in aviation, my safety standard was we will have 0 aviation accidents, right? I mean, I couldn't say, oh, we will accept 1 aviation accident this year, right? I mean, you can't do that. We did have some accidents though, and I realized that perfection is not possible when you are leading human beings. And so the question is, how do you reconcile that delta between a very high standard, a stretch goal, and a standard of excellence, because there's some delta in there? I think the debrief is how you do that. And it's about, why did we not achieve that high standard? And what can we do to close that gap and get closer to that very, very high standard that we're aspiring to?
Yeah, no, I think that's super helpful. And just what you were saying, which is to start as a leader by first saying what you could have done better. I think that that is such a great way to start it. Now I have to ask you, 6 hours.
Yeah.
What were you what were you all talking about for 6 hours?
Oh yeah. Well, whenever we flew a flight, average flight was about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on the type of mission. Anywhere from 2 to 50 aircraft airborne at any given time. And we had very specific mission objectives and very specific training objectives. And this kind of goes back to one of your earlier questions. Those training objectives were skills that we needed to be able to perfect and improve upon in order to accomplish the mission. And everyone that was in that flight had sometimes a different role and responsibility. And so, Dave Robinson had a certain responsibility within that flight for certain tasks that we needed to perform. And of course, these decisions are being made at, the speed of sound, sometimes twice the speed of sound, with, things happening in 3 dimensions and, very, very quickly. And we have recordings of our radar scope. We have recordings of aircraft positioning. We have recordings of the target. You can record everything. It's like everything you did of every second in that flight is recorded. And we would literally go through those recordings, person by person, to pick out, what you could have done better at this particular point in time to achieve the training objectives in order to make sure that we accomplish the mission. I never flew a flight where there was something that I couldn't improve upon. And it was always powerful as a leader to be the first to note, I didn't do that radar search very well. I could have done this better by doing A, B, and C in order to accomplish X, Y, and Z. And then everyone else was like, oh, well, if the flight lead can say that, then certainly there are many things that I could admit that I could have done better also.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Like as you were talking about what you were doing and all the things that could have been recorded and all the different variations, I understood much more deeply preparation
Yeah.
as as one of the P's of the 3 P's of the mission.
Yeah.
So relatedly, I think as we're talking about the mission and trying to achieve it, you also talk a lot about adaptability and decentralized decision making. I think the idea of decentralized decision making um, sounds sounds very appealing, and almost romantic in some ways. My
Yeah.
question is, how do you make sure that it doesn't just lead to chaos where everybody just does everything? Like in practice, what does it look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it does sound romantic, and it's a little ambiguous, and there's kind of squishy. What does it really mean? I'm glad you asked. I mean, I really think it comes down to empowerment, right? I mean, in reality, we live in a very fast-paced world, and decision making, if it's concentrated at the highest levels of an organization, that can be a constraint for speed and agility for any organization. So it's incumbent upon leaders, I think, to push that decision authority down to the lowest practical level within the organization. And practically, this is what I think it looks like. I think it starts with that leader's intent that I just mentioned earlier, right? If a leader can clearly articulate the what at a very high level, cast that vision, and then empower leaders at lower levels to make decisions. One way to do that is to start to clarify, Aiden, what I call decision thresholds, right? So if I'm working for you, you and I might have a conversation about what kinds of decisions Dave Robinson is authorized to make categorically, and what types of decisions you want me to make sure I share with you to get your input before that decision is made. You might also tell me some things that you want to be made aware of if they meet certain thresholds, so that I can provide a feedback loop there. But one way to make sure that this is a learning process without turning it into total chaos is to use weekly one-on-ones and feedback sessions for junior decision makers to share with their boss the decisions that they are planning on making, and to get that feedback like, hey boss, Aiden, here's the decision I need to make. You gave me the authority to make it. Unless directed otherwise, this is where I'm leaning. Have you seen this movie before? Is there any experience that might I might not be thinking about? You have a chance to weigh in, but I still feel like I own that decision. And you have a chance to train me and train my judgment. And that generates trust in that decision-making relationship as well. And then I can also debrief you on decisions that I made this week, and we can talk about how those panned out. And so I found that to be a very effective way of delegating decisions, but not completely letting go of the wheel, so to speak, and staying in that kind of supervisory role as a mentor.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's a good way to put it. And I agree. And for those, I guess, that were wondering, one-on-ones do happen in the Marines as well. So
Yeah.
that's good to hear. So David, this has been super helpful. I mean, so many different things that we covered. And one of the things we like to leave all of our guests with is just for all the managers and leaders out there who are constantly looking to get better at their craft, what words of wisdom, tips, or advice would you leave them with? And what I will say, like before you answer that question, though, is the substance of leadership. I'm so excited to read the book myself.
Mm.
By the time this interview is live, everybody should be able to get it. And I assume they'll be able to find it on Amazon and all the typical bookstores. And so very excited for that. But besides reading the book, what else would you leave everybody with?
Yeah, it's a great question and a tough question because this is kind of that, if you remember nothing else, moments, right? But I would just leave your audience and your team and your listeners with the following, and I call this the leadership paradox, right? I mean, the more you let go and give to your team, I found that the more you will get as a leader in terms of high performance. And so it's so hard sometimes to empower, to give away control, to give away decision-making authority because we all naturally want to concentrate that. But I found that the more you give away and the more that you're willing to let go, the more you'll get in terms of performance. And so the two, recommendations or tips that I would leave is number one, focus on empowering your team. Define the what. Leave the how up to your people. Ask them how they would do it, and then have a conversation when they come back and explain the how, and then ask questions. Have you thought about X, Y, and Z that might help fill in some of the gaps? And the second piece is to take care of your people by putting their interests ahead of your own. What I found is when we take care of our people and put their interests ahead of our interests, ahead of our agenda, they will do whatever it takes to take care of you as the leader in order to accomplish your team's mission. So that would be my final comments. The leadership paradox: empower your team and take care of your people.
And that's great advice and a great place to end it. David, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Aiden. It was my honor and a great privilege. Really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.